My father smashed a landscaping brick directly into my face just because my fiancé refused to leave me for my own sister. As warm blood poured down my cheek, my mother simply took a delicate sip of her mimosa and laughed. She told me we would finally see if my fiancé still loved me, with a permanently scarred face. They truly thought they had finally broken me for good. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed a corporate forensic accountant the exact legal weapon needed to completely dismantle their $50 million real estate empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who consistently underestimated your worth. The afternoon sun was beating down relentlessly on the concrete foundation of my father's brand new midtown Atlanta luxury plaza. The air was thick with Georgia summer humidity and the distinct sharp smell of fresh cement, but my younger sister Jasmine was completely oblivious to her surroundings. She stomped her foot against the unfinished flooring. Her designer silk sundress and expensive stiletto heels looked entirely absurd on an active construction site. Her perfectly manicured hands were balled into tight, furious fists. "How could you choose her over me, Caleb?" she screamed. Her high-pitched voice echoed sharply off the exposed steel beams above us. "Look at her and look at me. I am the face of this family, and she is just a boring calculator in a cheap suit." I stood a few feet away, holding my audit clipboard and maintaining a perfectly neutral expression. I am 29 years old, a senior forensic accountant who spends my days dealing with corporate fraudsters attempting to hide millions of dollars. In my line of work, I track missing assets, uncover hidden offshore accounts, and dismantle elaborate corporate lies piece by piece. I am highly trained to remain completely objective in the face of absolute chaos. Jasmine, throwing a childish public tantrum because a man rejected her advances, was nothing new to me. She had been making highly inappropriate comments all morning, brushing her shoulder against his arm on purpose, and asking him to explain complex investment strategies just so she could bat her eyelashes at him. My fiancé Caleb, a 31-year-old wealth manager with a sharp analytical mind and zero tolerance for nonsense, simply adjusted his hard hat and looked at her with pure disgust. "Jasmine, you are a married woman and you are embarrassing yourself," Caleb said, his voice dangerously calm and steady. "I love Chloe. I am marrying Chloe. Do not ever approach me like that again." I fully expected my father Desmond, who owned this entire commercial real estate development, to step in and reprimand his golden child for acting like a spoiled brat. Desmond had built his reputation on aggressive intimidation tactics, bullying contractors and city planners alike to get his way. Instead of correcting her, Desmond turned his furious, piercing gaze entirely on me. He marched across the dusty concrete floor, his work boots kicking up clouds of white powder. He stopped right in front of me, pointing a thick, calloused finger mere inches from my nose. "You did this on purpose, Chloe." My father barked, his face turning a deep shade of red with rage. "You brought him here today, just to humiliate your sister. You are always trying to ruin her happiness because you are intensely jealous of her. You are trying to ruin her marriage to Preston with these cheap stunts." "Jealous," I repeated, keeping my voice steady, despite the adrenaline currently surging through my veins. "Dad, she just tried to throw herself at my fiancé in broad daylight, while her own husband Preston is supposedly running the leasing office right downstairs." Desmond did not care about the facts. He only cared about protecting the pristine image of his perfect favored daughter. He grabbed me aggressively by the shoulder, spinning me around to face them. "You are going to apologize to Jasmine right now," he ordered, his grip tightening painfully on my collarbone. "You are going to tell Caleb that you provoked her into acting this way." I shook my head forcefully, pulling my arm out of his harsh grip. "I am not lying to protect her fragile ego." That simple denial snapped whatever thin restraint Desmond had left. He lunged toward a messy pile of landscaping materials, stacked near the metal scaffolding. Before Caleb could step between us, my father grabbed a heavy red clay brick and hurled it directly at my head with all his strength. The impact was absolutely deafening. A blinding pain exploded across the right side of my face, knocking me violently backward onto the unforgiving concrete. My vision went completely white, then fractured into spinning dark spots. Blood immediately poured from a deep gash near my temple, blinding my right eye and soaking the clean collar of my white blouse. Caleb dropped to his knees beside me instantly, his hands frantically pressing his cloth handkerchief against my bleeding face to stop the flow. I could hear him shouting at my father, but the sound felt incredibly muffled, like I was submerged underwater. Through my uninjured eye, I looked up and saw my mother Valerie standing near the shaded VIP viewing tent. She was draped in expensive white linen, completely unbothered by the violence that had just occurred. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her orange mimosa and smiled down at me coldly. "Let us see if your little wealth manager still wants you with a scarred face," Valerie said, her voice dripping with cruel venom. "You have always been the ugly, clumsy one in this family. Just like when you accidentally ruined Jasmine's sweet 16 party by falling into the cake table, you simply ruin everything you touch." I tasted heavy copper as warm blood ran down my cheek and slipped into my mouth. The childhood memory she weaponized was a complete lie. I had been shoved into that cake by Jasmine herself, but in my family, the truth was whatever my parents collectively decided it was. I was always the convenient scapegoat, the dark academic daughter who never fit their elite Atlanta socialite narrative. Jasmine was the popular influencer, the beautiful prize they paraded around town. My bleeding on their brand new construction site was just considered another annoying inconvenience to them. Caleb pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his hands slick and stained with my blood. "I am calling 911, he yelled, his voice shaking with pure protective fury. "You are going to jail Desmond for assault." My father did not show a single ounce of remorse or fear. He stepped forward, casting a long, dark shadow over us, and snatched the phone right out of Caleb's hand, throwing it hard against a steel support beam, where it shattered into dozens of pieces. "You call the cops," Desmond threatened, towering menacingly over my fiancé, "and I will have your precious wealth management firm blacklisted in Atlanta before midnight. I know every major developer in this city, Caleb. I will ruin your entire career, and I will make sure Chloe never works in forensic accounting ever again. Get her out of my sight right now before I do something much worse." In the distance, the faint but unmistakable wail of police sirens began to cut through the heavy, humid air, immediately cutting off my father's arrogant tirade. Someone out on the busy street had already seen the violent assault and made the emergency call. My parents exchanged a quick look of panic as the reality of the situation finally set in. They thought they controlled everything in our lives. They had no idea the absolute legal and financial war they had just started. The silent car ride back to my apartment was thick with heavy tension. My face throbbed with every pulse of my heartbeat, and the 15 fresh stitches near my temple pulled painfully whenever I blinked my eye. Caleb kept one hand securely on the steering wheel, and his other hand firmly wrapped around mine. Neither of us spoke a single word about the bizarre $5 million medical lien the billing nurse had just discovered in the hospital system. I was entirely too exhausted and in far too much physical agony to untangle a complex corporate web of offshore shell companies tonight. I just desperately needed my own bed and a cold ice pack. But peace is a luxury my family has never allowed me to have. The moment I walked through my front door and dropped my keys on the kitchen counter, my cell phone began to vibrate violently against the granite surface. It was not just one text message, it was dozens of notifications pouring in by the second, causing my phone screen to flash like a frantic strobe light. Caleb frowned deeply and reached for his own phone to check his alerts. I sank heavily onto the living room sofa and opened my social media apps to see what disaster was unfolding. There it was at the very top of my feed. Jasmine had already uploaded a highly edited, heavily filtered video to her massive online following. She sat in the front seat of her luxury vehicle, clutching a crumpled tissue to her chest. The bright ring light reflected perfectly in her wide, tear-filled eyes. I watched in absolute horror as my sister delivered the manipulative performance of a lifetime. She choked back fake sobs as she looked directly into the camera lens, putting on the ultimate show for her millions of devoted subscribers. Guys, I need to talk about something really traumatic that happened today, Jasmine whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured fear and vulnerability. My sister Chloe had a severe manic episode at our family construction site. She came at me completely unprovoked. She was out of her mind with jealousy and tried to physically attack me. My dad had to step in and use physical force just to protect me from her violent outburst. It was absolutely terrifying, and I am just so incredibly thankful my father was there to save my life. Please pray for Chloe to get the psychiatric help she desperately needs. The deceptive video already had over 2 million views. The comment section beneath the post was an absolute war zone of rabid fans calling for my immediate arrest. They were praising Desmond as a hero father who bravely protected his innocent daughter from a deranged attacker. They were digging up my personal information and posting it publicly for the world to see. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of her vicious lies, my phone screen switched to an incoming call from my boss at the corporate liquidation firm. I answered the call and was immediately met with deafening screaming. "Chloe, what the hell is going on?" my boss shouted through the speaker. "Our firm public profiles are being absolutely flooded with one-star reviews right now. People are calling the main office switchboard demanding you be fired immediately. They are saying we employ a violent psychopath who attacks her own sister. We handle multi-million-dollar corporate asset liquidations, and our elite clients demand absolute discretion and professionalism. You are a complete public relations nightmare right now, and you are jeopardizing our most lucrative contracts." I tried to explain the actual truth of the situation. I told him my father had violently assaulted me with a brick, and my sister was weaponizing her massive audience to cover up a violent felony. My boss did not care about the truth or my injuries. He only cared about the bottom line and the firm pristine reputation. He told me I was officially on unpaid administrative leave effective immediately until the internet mob moved on to their next target. He hung up the phone, leaving me sitting in stunned, deafening silence. I had just lost my family health insurance, my physical safety, and now my entire career all in the span of 4 miserable hours. Caleb paced the living room floor, his fists clenched in pure, unadulterated outrage as he listened to my side of the phone call. He grabbed his car keys and headed straight toward the front door, ready for a fight. "I am calling the police right now," Caleb declared, his voice echoing in the quiet apartment. "We are taking your hospital records, the graphic photographs of your stitches, and the emergency room medical report directly to the authorities tonight. We will sue her for defamation, and we will sue him for aggravated assault. They cannot get away with this, Chloe." I shook my head slowly, wincing as the small movement pulled sharply at my facial wound. I reached for my heavy work laptop on the coffee table and booted it up. "Do not bother Caleb," I said, pulling up my encrypted offshore database access software. "They did this exact same thing to me when I was 18 years old. Desmond and Valerie drained my entire college savings fund to pay off one of Jasmine's early credit card debts because she maxed it out on designer clothes. When I discovered the theft and threatened to go to the police, they beat me to the punch. They convinced our entire extended family and our tight-knit church community that I had stolen the money myself to fund a secret, dangerous drug habit. I was exiled from the family while Jasmine got a brand new luxury car as a reward. They control the narrative, Caleb. They always have, and they always will. But I control the money, and numbers never lie." My fingers flew rapidly across the illuminated keyboard, ignoring the intense throbbing pain radiating through my skull. I logged directly into the International Corporate Registry, bypassing the standard public searches. I needed to know exactly why a Cayman Islands shell company had placed a $5 million medical lien against my personal Social Security number. If my father was trying to ruin my life, I was going to financially ruin his entire empire. I used my senior forensic accounting credentials to aggressively access the deep offshore financial records. I traced the massive medical lien back to a holding company called Apex Holdings Incorporated. I meticulously followed the hidden money trail from the holding company to a highly secure private wealth trust hidden in the Caribbean. I deployed a tracking algorithm and cracked the trust registration documents. I stared at the primary beneficiary name listed brightly on the screen. The blood ran completely cold in my veins, and my breath caught in my throat. The shell company holding the $5 million lien against me was not registered to my father, Desmond. It was registered under Preston, Jasmine, perfectly polished country club husband. The two federal agents stepped forward into the lavish office, flashing their official golden credentials under the bright recessed lighting. Preston dropped his aggressive, threatening posture in an absolute instant. His arrogant smirk completely vanished, replaced by a sickening pale shade of terror as he stumbled backward against his mahogany desk. He stammered frantically, demanding to know what was going on, and threatening to call his high-powered corporate lawyers. Caleb stood tall and completely unfazed by the sudden panic in the room. He calmly explained to Preston that the federal agents were not actually there to arrest him today. They were simply there from the Financial Regulatory Commission to conduct a routine but highly thorough compliance audit on his luxury real estate brokerage firm. Caleb casually mentioned that as a licensed wealth manager, he was federally mandated to report any suspicious offshore wire transfers he uncovered during his professional duties. Preston gripped the edge of his desk, looking like he was about to physically vomit. He suddenly realized Caleb had triggered a massive federal audit just by making a single well-placed phone call. The two large security guards immediately released my arms and backed away toward the hallway, wanting absolutely nothing to do with federal investigators. I straightened my ruined white blouse, grabbed my thick stack of offshore financial documents from his keyboard, and walked right out of the office with Caleb by my side. We left Preston and Jasmine standing there in a state of absolute suffocating dread. As soon as Caleb and I got into his car in the underground parking garage, my cell phone started ringing aggressively. The screen displayed my father, Desmond, calling. I answered the phone and immediately put him on speaker so Caleb could hear every single word. Desmond was absolutely screaming on the other end of the line, his voice vibrating with pure, unhinged rage. He accused me of being a malicious traitor for bringing federal agents into his son-in-law private office. He said I was actively trying to destroy the entire family business just because I was throwing a childish tantrum over a tiny little scrape on my face. I touched the thick white medical bandage covering my temple, feeling a sharp spike of pain from the tiny little scrape that had required 15 stitches and nearly blinded my right eye. I told my father very clearly that he committed massive identity theft to secure a $5 million shadow loan and that I had all the proof. Desmond completely ignored my accusation and went straight for the throat just like he always did. He threatened to call the managing partners at Caleb firm and have him fired before the business day was over. He promised to use all his elite country club connections to ensure neither of us ever worked in the financial sector again. I did not even give him the satisfaction of a response. I just reached out and ended the call, leaving him shouting into the void. Less than 5 minutes later, my phone started ringing again. This time, it was my mother, Valerie. Her tone was entirely different from my father's explosive rage. She used that sickly sweet, highly manipulative voice she always adopted when she wanted to smooth over a public disaster and protect her precious family image. "Chloe, darling," she said, acting as if she had not just watched my father smash a brick into my skull. "You are tearing this family apart over a simple misunderstanding. Your father is under a tremendous amount of stress with the new midtown plaza, and you deliberately provoked your sister." Valerie then offered me what she genuinely believed was a reasonable compromise. She told me that if I just went back and apologized to Jasmine for being so jealous and dropped Caleb immediately for disrespecting my father, they would generously pay for my plastic surgery. She actually said they would hire the absolute best cosmetic surgeon in Atlanta, so I would not have to walk around looking like a scarred monster for the rest of my life. The sheer toxic cruelty of her offer took my breath away. She valued a fake apology to her golden child more than her own daughter's physical safety and basic human dignity. I told my mother I would rather walk around looking like a monster forever than actually be a monster like her. Then I hung up the phone and permanently blocked her number. Caleb drove us straight back to my apartment so I could properly recover, but rest was the absolute last thing on my mind. I immediately set up a highly secure workstation on my dining room table, connecting my heavy work laptop to multiple encrypted servers. If my family thought they could intimidate me into backing down, they were completely wrong. I pulled up the primary financial architecture of Desmond Real Estate Development Company. He had dozens of dummy corporations and shell entities designed specifically to hide his massive debts and shield his personal assets. I started cracking his administrative passwords one by one, using a backdoor entry protocol I discovered years ago when I first became a forensic accountant. As the firewall dropped and his private corporate ledgers flooded my screen, I let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. I pointed to the chaotic financial mess on the monitor and looked up at Caleb. Dad always told me I was way too stupid to handle the family accounts. I muttered, my fingers flying rapidly across the keyboard. He used to say my brain was just too small to understand high-level commercial real estate investments. Now I know he just did not want me to see the absolute rot hiding behind his fake empire. He knew I was smart enough to spot the fraud instantly. I ran a comprehensive audit algorithm across all of Desmond corporate holdings. I was actively looking for any other fraudulent loans he might have taken out using my pristine credit score. The software aggressively searched through thousands of property deeds, bank statements, and collateral agreements. Suddenly, the entire screen flashed red with a critical, high-priority alert. I opened the flagged document, and my heart completely stopped beating in my chest. The blood drained entirely from my face as I read the complex legal jargon carefully. This was not just a simple $5 million medical lien. I pulled up the original incorporation documents for my father's entire real estate empire dating back exactly 13 years. Desmond did not just use my identity for a single shadow loan. He had legally forged my signature to make me the sole personal guarantor of his entire failing corporate structure when I was just 18 years old. He had systematically transferred all the terminal corporate debt to my name, right under my nose while I was away at college. If his over-leveraged company goes under, which his current ledgers proved it was about to do, he walks away completely clean with hidden offshore cash. Meanwhile, I will be held entirely responsible for over $50 million in defaulted commercial loans, and I will be the one going to federal prison for his massive financial crimes. The blue light of my laptop screen illuminated Caleb's horrified expression as we both stared at the forged guarantor documents. My father had not just stolen my identity to secure a single construction loan, he had weaponized my entire financial future. When I was just 18 years old, Desmond had systematically forged my signature across dozens of digital commercial loan agreements. He had legally bound me as the sole guarantor for his entire $50 million real estate empire. Every single failing strip mall, every over-leveraged apartment complex, and every sinking midtown plaza was anchored directly to my social security number. I furiously typed new commands into the terminal, pulling up Desmond active cash flow ledgers. The financial picture was infinitely worse than a simple failing business. Desmond was actively bleeding his own company dry. He was frantically transferring massive sums of liquid capital into Preston offshore Cayman Islands shell accounts disguised as consulting fees and material expenses. He was intentionally tanking his own corporate structure. He is preparing to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Look at these asset transfers, Caleb. He is hiding all the liquid cash offshore so the courts cannot touch it. The second his company officially declares bankruptcy, the federal commercial lenders will instantly default to the sole guarantor to collect the $50 million. Caleb clenched his jaw, staring at the cascading numbers. They will come directly after you, Chloe. And because these are federally backed commercial loans, the moment they discover the fraudulent financial statements Desmond submitted under your name, you will be the one facing federal wire fraud charges. You will go to prison for his crimes. I checked the timestamps on the offshore transfers. The frequency was accelerating rapidly. Desmond was rushing the process because he knew I was actively digging into his files. He was going to file the bankruptcy paperwork by Monday morning. I was in an absolute race against time. If that bankruptcy filing hit the federal docket before I could freeze the associated bank accounts, my entire life was completely over. I slammed the laptop shut and grabbed my coat. "We are going to First Atlanta Trust," I told Caleb, grabbing my keys. "They hold the primary commercial accounts for his development firm. I have to freeze the corporate assets before he can drain the last of the cash and file the paperwork." The drive into the financial district was tense and silent. My face throbbed relentlessly with every bump in the road, but the physical pain was entirely muted by the sheer adrenaline flooding my system. We marched through the heavy brass doors of First Atlanta Trust, ignoring the bewildered tellers, and headed straight for the executive management suites. I demanded to see the senior branch manager immediately. Richard Sterling was a pompous, silver-haired executive who looked like he had been manufactured in the exact same country club laboratory as my father. He sat behind a massive glass desk, wearing a smug, superior expression that instantly made my blood boil. I slammed my printed evidence directly onto his pristine blotter, demanding an immediate administrative freeze on all Desmond Wilson corporate accounts due to fraudulent guarantor documentation and active identity theft. Sterling leaned back in his expensive chair and let out a dismissive, patronizing sigh. He recognized me immediately. He was one of Desmond's regular golf buddies. He looked at the medical bandages covering my face with a mixture of amusement and utter disdain. "Chloe, you need to calm down," Sterling said, clasping his hands together. "Your father warned me you were having a severe mental health episode today. He said you might come in here making wild, unfounded accusations. I cannot just freeze multi-million-dollar commercial accounts based on the hysterical demands of a disgruntled daughter. Now excuse me for a moment while I review these papers." Sterling stood up and stepped out of his office, pulling his cell phone from his pocket. Through the glass walls, I watched him dial a number and speak frantically into the receiver. He was tipping off my father. He was giving Desmond the exact warning he needed to initiate the final offshore transfers. Sterling returned a minute later looking entirely too confident. He sat back down and pushed my documents across the desk. "I am sorry, Chloe, but without a direct federal court order signed by a judge, I absolutely refuse to restrict your father access to his own money," Sterling declared with a nasty grin. "Now I suggest you leave my bank before I call security and have you arrested for trespassing." He thought I was just a desperate, helpless daughter throwing a tantrum. He completely forgot that I am a senior corporate liquidator who dismantles corrupt financial institutions for a living. I did not argue. I did not yell. I simply opened my laptop right there on his desk and tethered it to my mobile hotspot. "You are right, Richard," I said, my fingers flying across the keys in a blur of motion. "You definitely need a federal order. But I do not need your permission to get one." I bypassed his branch authority entirely. I used my elite senior liquidator credentials to access the Federal Reserve secure regulatory portal. This was the exact administrative system used by the government to shut down banks suspected of laundering money or financing terrorism. I typed in the specific routing numbers for First Atlanta Trust and cross-referenced them with Desmond corporate accounts. In the primary action field, I filed a direct immediate administrative freeze on the entire institution, citing verified suspicion of multi-million-dollar wire fraud and executive identity theft. I hit enter. A bright green confirmation banner flashed across my screen. I turned the laptop around so Sterling could see it clearly. "I just flagged your entire branch through the Federal Reserve," I stated, my voice radiating absolute lethal calm. "Every single account associated with Desmond Wilson is now locked under a federal anti-fraud mandate. If you authorize the transfer of a single penny out of those accounts before a federal judge reviews my evidence, you will be indicted as a willing co-conspirator in a $50 million wire fraud scheme. You will lose your banking license, your pension, and your freedom. Have a wonderful afternoon, Richard." Sterling's face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Caleb and I did not wait for a response. We turned around and walked straight out of the executive suite, leaving the arrogant bank manager choking on his own panic. The adrenaline was crashing hard as we pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the humid Atlanta air. A triumphant spark ignited in my chest. I had successfully blocked my father from ruining my life. I had cut off his escape route. Now it was just a matter of tearing down the rest of his empire brick by brick. We walked down the concrete ramp into the dim underground parking garage. The echoing sound of our footsteps was suddenly interrupted by the sharp, distinct crunch of broken glass under my boots. I stopped dead in my tracks. Caleb's car was sitting in its designated parking spot, but the driver's side window was completely shattered. Millions of tiny glass fragments glittered across the dark asphalt. A heavy red landscaping brick identical to the one that had smashed into my face earlier that afternoon was sitting perfectly centered on the leather driver's seat. Tucked neatly beneath the jagged edge of the clay brick was a folded piece of white stationery. Caleb rushed forward, swearing loudly, but I was completely frozen. I reached through the shattered window and carefully pulled the piece of paper free. I unfolded it with trembling hands. The message was handwritten in the aggressive, sharp penmanship I had known my entire life. Sign the waiver, or the next brick finishes the job. Dad. The very next morning, the blinding pain in my head was completely overshadowed by the pure burning fury radiating through my entire body. I did not bother calling ahead to make an appointment. I barely even stopped to look in the mirror as I secured a thick white medical bandage over the 15 fresh stitches marring the right side of my face. I grabbed the thick stack of freshly printed financial documents tracing the Cayman Islands Shell Company and drove straight downtown to the elite commercial district. I was operating on zero sleep and pure adrenaline. Preston operated his luxury real estate brokerage out of a massive glass corner suite on the 40th floor of the most expensive building in the city. It was a space designed entirely to intimidate people with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling Atlanta skyline and expensive modern art hanging on every single wall. I completely ignored the protests of his bewildered receptionist and marched straight past her large marble desk. I pushed open the heavy oak doors to Preston's private office without bothering to knock. Preston was sitting behind his pristine mahogany desk, wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit and sipping an espresso. He looked up with a sudden flash of annoyance that quickly morphed into an arrogant, highly punchable smirk when he saw my bandaged face. I did not give him a single second to speak or prepare a defense. I threw the heavy stack of offshore financial documents directly onto his keyboard, scattering his neat pile of morning reports across the polished wood. Explain to me right now why a Cayman Islands shell company registered in your exact name currently holds a $5 million medical lien against my personal social security number. I demanded, my voice echoing loudly off his expensive glass walls. Preston did not even flinch. He leaned back in his expensive leather executive chair and let out a loud, obnoxious laugh. He picked up the top page of my forensic accounting report and casually tossed it back onto the desk, like it was a meaningless piece of trash. He looked at me as if I was a foolish child who had wandered into an adult conversation. Before he could even attempt to formulate an answer, the door to his private executive bathroom swung open. Jasmine stepped out, smoothing down the skirt of a completely inappropriate skin-tight designer dress. She froze for a fraction of a second when she saw me standing there, but her shock instantly melted into a cruel, calculating sneer. She slowly walked over to stand behind her husband, placing her perfectly manicured hands protectively on his broad shoulders. "Oh my God, look at your face!" Jasmine mocked, pointing a delicate finger at my thick medical bandages. "You actually look like a movie monster, Chloe. It is absolutely repulsive. I cannot believe they let you walk through the building lobby looking like a complete freak. I guess that stupid little wealth manager of yours must have a weird fetish if he is still willing to be seen in public with a scarred spinster like you." I completely ignored her pathetic high school bullying tactics and kept my one good eye entirely focused on Preston. "Answer the question, Preston," I said coldly, gripping the edge of his desk. "You stole my identity. You placed a massive fraudulent lien against my name. That is a federal crime, and you are going to explain exactly how you pulled it off." Preston smirked again and took another slow sip of his espresso, setting the cup down with a deliberate clink. "I did not steal anything, Chloe," he said, his tone dripping with condescending superiority. "Your father practically handed your identity to me on a silver platter." Desmond was completely overextended on his credit. He desperately needed a massive influx of cash to finish framing that new luxury midtown plaza. No legitimate bank in the state of Georgia was going to lend him another dime because he is drowning in hidden debts and pending lawsuits. But you, Chloe, you have a completely pristine credit history. You have no debt, no mortgages, and a perfect financial record. You are the ultimate blank check. Jasmine giggled, tracing her fingers along Preston's collar. Daddy knew you would never agree to help the family, Jasmine added maliciously. You are too selfish and obsessed with your own little career. So he just sold your identity to Preston as collateral for a private shadow loan. Preston set up the offshore shell company and funded the plaza construction. Your name is on the hook for all $5 million. If the plaza fails, you go bankrupt. If you try to fight it, we will just bury you in legal fees until you break. You are both completely delusional, I said, staring at them in absolute disbelief. You committed massive wire fraud and identity theft. Did you honestly think a senior forensic accountant would not find a $5 million shadow lien attached to her own social security number? You handed a financial investigator the exact paper trail needed to put you both in federal prison. Preston slammed his coffee cup down on the desk, his arrogant facade slipping into pure, unadulterated aggression. He reached over and slammed his hand down on the intercom button. "Security, get up to my office immediately," Preston shouted into the speaker. "I need a crazy woman removed from the premises right now." He stood up, towering over the desk, and pointed a threatening finger directly at my face. "You are not going to do anything, Chloe. I am completely untouchable in this city. My firm brings in hundreds of millions of dollars. The rich write the rules and people like you just follow them. You are nothing but a jealous, scarred spinster trying to ruin your sister's perfect marriage because you know you will never be half the woman she is. Nobody is ever going to believe a hysterical, jealous woman over a respected real estate mogul and a prominent developer like your father." I did not back down a single inch. I stood my ground as the heavy office doors flew open behind me and two large security guards rushed into the room. I raised my left wrist and deliberately tapped the face of my sleek black smartwatch. The small red recording light stopped blinking. "I do not need them to believe a hysterical woman, Preston," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "I just need them to listen to the crystal-clear audio recording of you fully admitting to $5 million worth of federal wire fraud and identity theft. I recorded every single word of your arrogant little confession." Preston's face drained of all color. His smug smile vanished instantly, replaced by absolute sheer panic. Jasmine let out a high-pitched gasp and backed away from the desk as if it had suddenly caught fire. "Grab her!" Preston yelled at the security guards, his voice cracking with desperation. "Take her watch. Do not let her leave this room with that recording." The two massive security guards lunged forward, grabbing my arms roughly and yanking me backward toward the exit. I did not struggle. I did not scream. I just kept my eyes locked directly on Preston's terrified face, watching his entire world crumble in real time. Just as the guards were about to drag me forcefully out into the hallway, the heavy glass doors of the executive suite swung wide open. Caleb walked calmly into the room, looking completely composed in his tailored charcoal suit. He did not look at the security guards holding me. He did not look at Jasmine cowering behind the desk. He looked straight at Preston. Behind Caleb, two tall men with severe expressions stepped into the plush office. They were wearing dark conservative suits and holding up golden federal badges that caught the morning light perfectly. "She might be leaving, Preston," Caleb said, his voice ringing out with absolute triumphant authority. "But they are not." I stared at the jagged handwriting on the crisp white paper. The sharp letters practically bled with my father's arrogant malice. Caleb snatched the note from my trembling fingers, and his face contorted with a mixture of absolute horror and protective rage. He looked at the heavy red landscaping brick sitting amidst the sea of shattered safety glass on his leather driver's seat. "We are leaving right now," Caleb said, his voice vibrating with urgency. "We are driving straight to a secure hotel downtown, and I am calling the federal agents back. This is witness intimidation and a direct death threat. You are not safe anywhere near these people, Chloe. We need to go into hiding until the authorities dismantle his operation." I reached out and gently pushed his hand away. I brushed a pile of glittering glass fragments off the passenger seat and climbed into the car. I am absolutely done hiding, Caleb, I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the chaotic adrenaline flooding my veins. Hiding is exactly what they want me to do. They want me cowering in some dark hotel room, terrified of my own shadow, while they spin their lies and figure out a new way to destroy my life. If I run away now, they win. Get in the car. We are going to Buckhead. Caleb stared at me as if I had completely lost my mind, but he did not argue. He carefully cleared the brick and the remaining glass from his seat before starting the engine. The drive to my parents' elite gated community in the wealthy northern suburbs was a surreal blur. The hot, humid Georgia wind whipped violently through the shattered window, violently stinging my bandaged face and tangling my hair into a messy knot. I did not care. I spent the entire 40-minute drive meticulously preparing the necessary legal filings on my laptop, utilizing the encrypted mobile hotspot. As the sole legal guarantor of the entire corporate structure, I had absolute sweeping executive powers that Desmond had never anticipated I would actually discover or understand how to use. He thought he had built a foolproof trap. He had actually handed me the keys to his entire kingdom. We arrived at the imposing wrought iron gates of the prestigious country club community. Instead of stopping at the security kiosk to announce myself, I aggressively tailgated a large floral delivery van straight through the opening gates, before the mechanical arms could close. I directed Caleb down the winding oak-lined streets until we reached my parents' massive sprawling colonial mansion. The circular driveway was completely packed with luxury European sedans and expensive sports cars. My mother Valerie was hosting her annual high society spring garden party. The manicured back lawns were swarming with elite Atlanta socialites, wealthy politicians, and prominent country club members. I stepped out of the car, ignoring Caleb's frantic warnings to wait for police backup. I marched straight up the cobblestone pathway and around the side of the massive house directly toward the extravagant backyard patio. The scene was absolutely picturesque. Dozens of women in expensive pastel silk dresses were sipping imported champagne while a live jazz quartet played softly on the elevated stone terrace. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated with silver trays of delicate appetizers. It was the ultimate display of fake Southern perfection, and I was about to burn it straight to the ground. I pushed through the decorative wrought iron trellis gate and stepped onto the immaculate green lawn. Several guests immediately stopped talking and stared in shock at my ruined, bloody clothes and the thick white medical bandages covering the side of my face. Valerie was holding court near the extravagant tiered water fountain in the center of the patio. She was laughing brightly at something a state senator wife had just said. She turned her head and her eyes locked directly onto me. Her perfect porcelain smile vanished in an instant, replaced by a look of absolute sheer panic. She dropped her champagne glass onto a nearby table and practically sprinted across the grass to intercept me before I could reach the main crowd. She grabbed my arm with bruising force, digging her manicured fingernails deep into my skin. "What the hell are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for my ears. "You are ruining my event. Get out of here right now before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." I yanked my arm out of her harsh grip and took a deliberate step forward. "I am not going anywhere, Mom," I said loudly, ensuring my voice carried over the soft jazz music. Valerie panicked. She realized she could not physically force me off the property without causing a massive scene, so she immediately pivoted to her favorite defensive strategy. She turned toward her wealthy friends and plastered a look of devastating maternal heartbreak across her face. "I am so sorry, everyone," Valerie announced loudly, projecting her voice so the entire garden party could hear. "Please excuse this terrible disruption. My daughter Chloe is having a severe drug-induced psychotic break. She has been struggling with heavy narcotics for years and she is completely out of her mind right now. We have been trying so hard to get her into a secure psychiatric facility, but she keeps running away. Please just ignore her." The wealthy guests gasped in synchronized horror, clutching their pearls and whispering frantically to one another. Valerie looked back at me with a triumphant, malicious smirk, fully believing she had successfully discredited me in front of her entire social circle. She expected me to crumble in shame and run away crying. Instead, I walked straight past her and marched directly up the stone steps of the elevated terrace. The jazz quartet stopped playing immediately as I stepped right into the middle of their setup. I reached out and yanked the silver microphone off its heavy iron stand. A sharp, piercing whine of audio feedback echoed across the silent backyard, causing several guests to cover their ears. I gripped the microphone tightly and looked down at the sea of shocked faces before locking my eyes directly onto my mother. "Mom, is this exactly like the time you told the entire church choir I was in a mandatory residential rehab facility just so you could steal the spotlight and gain sympathy at my high school graduation?" I asked, my voice echoing loudly through the massive outdoor speakers. "Or is this like the time you and Dad drained my entire college savings account to pay off Jasmine massive credit card debts and then told the entire family I stole the money to buy illegal drugs?" You have always been a fantastic storyteller, Valerie, but today your audience is finally going to hear the actual truth. The silence in the backyard was absolutely deafening. Nobody moved a single muscle. Valerie's face turned a brilliant shade of crimson as her wealthy friends turned to stare at her with mounting suspicion and disgust. Before I could continue exposing her decades of toxic lies, the heavy glass patio doors at the back of the mansion violently slammed open. Desmond charged out of the house like a raging bull. His face was purple with uncontrolled fury, and his fists were balled so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He had clearly just received the frantic phone call from his bank manager regarding the federal freeze on his corporate accounts. He spotted me standing on the terrace with the microphone and let out a guttural roar of pure anger. "Shut your mouth, you ungrateful little brat!" Desmond bellowed, charging aggressively across the patio, tearing through the crowd of terrified socialites. "Give me that microphone right now before I throw you off this property myself." He lunged up the stone steps, reaching out violently to rip the equipment from my hands. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I stood my ground and looked down at him with absolute unyielding authority. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the thick stack of freshly printed and officially notarized corporate restructuring documents I had finalized during the car ride over. I held the heavy stack of papers up in the air for just a second, ensuring Desmond recognized exactly what they were. Then I casually opened my hand and dropped the entire stack of documents directly into the rushing water of the ornate tiered fountain beside the stage. "By the way, Dad," I said, my amplified voice ringing out with absolute devastating finality, "I did not just freeze your corporate bank accounts today. Since you illegally made me the sole legal guarantor of your entire fraudulent financial empire, I hold absolute unilateral executive power over all your assets. I just legally fired you from your own company. You have absolutely nothing left." Desmond stood completely paralyzed on the stone steps of the terrace. The color rapidly drained from his weathered face as the absolute reality of my words finally hit him. The arrogant, untouchable real estate mogul was suddenly reduced to a trembling, desperate old man right in front of his elite social circle. He lunged forward, screaming a string of vicious obscenities and demanding I hand over the restructuring documents, but Caleb quickly stepped between us, acting as a human shield. Caleb grabbed my arm and guided me smoothly through the crowd of stunned, silent socialites. Valerie was wailing hysterically near the tiered fountain, her perfect high society garden party completely and utterly ruined. We walked right out the front gates of the mansion and got back into Caleb's car, leaving my parents to face the suffocating music of their own destruction. Caleb drove us straight out of the wealthy northern suburbs and headed deep into the city. We needed a secure base of operations away from my vulnerable apartment. He drove to a high-security boutique hotel downtown and booked a luxury corner suite under a corporate alias, paying for the entire week in cash to avoid any digital tracking. Once we were safely inside the suite with the heavy deadbolts locked, I immediately fired up my heavy work laptop and tethered it to the encrypted servers. The administrative freeze was fully active and the corporate takeover was locked into the Federal Registry. Desmond was completely locked out of every single corporate portal, every commercial bank account, and every digital ledger he had ever owned. I watched the system logs light up like a chaotic Christmas tree as he frantically tried to use his old executive passwords to regain entry. Each desperate attempt was met with a brutal flashing access denied notification. He was losing his mind. He was trapped in a financial cage of his own making, and I held the only key. The tension in the hotel suite was thick and suffocating. Caleb was pacing the hardwood floor, making discreet phone calls to federal regulatory contacts to ensure the freeze remained uncontested. I was aggressively monitoring the server logs for any sign of a backdoor breach. Then a soft, hesitant knock echoed through the heavy wooden door of our suite. Caleb stopped pacing and motioned for me to stay put while he checked the security peephole. Desmond had obviously used his elite private security connections to track Caleb's license plate to the hotel parking garage. Caleb let out a sharp, exhausted sigh and unlocked the deadbolt. Jasmine stepped into the room. She looked absolutely pathetic. Her expensive designer makeup was completely smeared down her cheeks, and her silk dress was rumpled. Desmond had clearly realized he could not physically intimidate me or financially overpower me anymore, so he sent his golden child to play the ultimate victim. Jasmine collapsed onto the velvet sofa in the center of the room, burying her face in her hands and sobbing loudly. It was an award-winning theatrical performance. "Chloe, you have to undo this!" Jasmine wailed, looking up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Daddy is having a complete mental breakdown. He is screaming at his lawyers and smashing things in the study. You took everything away from him. From all of us." I crossed my arms and stared at her, completely unfazed by her manufactured tears. "You mean I took away the stolen money you and your husband were using to fund your lavish lifestyle?" I corrected her coldly. Jasmine wiped her eyes, smudging her dark mascara even further. "Preston is furious," she sobbed, her voice trembling with genuine panic. "He told me that if the offshore accounts stay frozen, the Cayman Shell Company will collapse by tomorrow morning. He said he will leave me Chloe. He will file for divorce and leave me with absolutely nothing. You know exactly how he is about money. He only married me because of the family wealth. If the money stops flowing, he is gone." She jumped up from the velvet sofa and grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging painfully deep into my sleeve. "You have to give the company back right now. You have always been the strong one, Chloe. You know how to survive on your own. You know how to work hard and struggle and build things from scratch. I have never worked a single day in my life. I do not know how to do anything else. I cannot survive being poor." I looked down at her hands gripping my arm and felt a wave of absolute sickening disgust. I reached out and forcefully peeled her fingers off my sleeve, pushing her back toward the sofa. I walked over to the heavy oak vanity in the corner of the hotel suite and picked up a heavy silver hand mirror. I turned back around and slid the mirror directly across the smooth glass coffee table until it stopped right in front of her lap. "Take a good look," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "Look right into that glass, Jasmine. That is exactly what a parasite looks like." She stared at the silver mirror, her mouth hanging open in complete shock. "You have spent your entire life feeding off my pain and feeding off this family's stolen money?" I continued, stepping closer to her until she was forced to look up at my bandaged face. "You stood in Preston office just a few hours ago and laughed at my fresh scars. You mocked me for working hard while you actively stole my identity to fund your husband's fraudulent midtown plaza, and now you expect me to go to federal prison just so you do not have to give up your designer dresses and your elite country club membership. Get out of my room, Jasmine. Get out before I call hotel security and have you physically removed." Jasmine realized her fake tears were completely useless. The pitiful, vulnerable victim facade instantly melted away, replaced by the exact same cold, calculating malice I had seen in Preston office. She snatched her expensive leather purse off the sofa and shot me a look of pure, unadulterated venom. "You are going to regret this, Chloe," she hissed, her voice dripping with raw hatred. "You are going to lose absolutely everything." She spun around on her heels and marched aggressively toward the heavy wooden door. Caleb was standing near the entryway, holding the door open for her with a stern expression. As Jasmine brushed past him, she intentionally bumped her shoulder hard against his chest. It looked like a petty, childish gesture of lingering anger, but my eyes caught the rapid, subtle movement of her hand. As she collided with Caleb, she swiftly unzipped the side pocket of his leather laptop bag resting on the entryway console. In one fluid, seamless motion, she slipped a small silver USB drive directly into the bag and zipped it shut before stepping out into the brightly lit hallway. The heavy door clicked closed behind her, leaving Caleb and me alone in the silent suite, completely unaware of the digital bomb she had just planted in our possession. The digital bomb detonated less than 12 hours later. The harsh ringing of Caleb's cell phone shattered the quiet calm of our hotel suite just before dawn. Caleb answered groggily, but within seconds, he was sitting bolt upright on the edge of the mattress. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in the dim morning light. He ended the call and stared blankly at the dark hotel wall. "The Securities and Exchange Commission just raided my firm," Caleb said, his voice hollow and trembling with shock. "My managing partner just suspended me indefinitely. The federal agents flagged my specific terminal and my personal administrative accounts for massive insider trading and unauthorized offshore market manipulation. They have frozen my wealth management license pending a full criminal investigation." I sat up, throwing the heavy hotel blankets aside. "That is completely impossible," I said, moving quickly toward the desk where our equipment was set up. "You have not authorized a single trade outside of your standard client portfolios in months." Caleb walked over to his leather messenger bag sitting on the entryway console. He reached inside and pulled out the small, sleek silver USB drive Jasmine had slipped into the side pocket the night before. He held it up between his fingers, his expression morphing from shock into pure, self-directed rage. "I found this loose in the bottom of my bag this morning when I woke up early to check the Asian markets." Caleb explained, his voice tight with anger. "I thought it was one of my encrypted offline client drives that had slipped out of its protective case. I plugged it into my laptop just to verify the directory path. The second the metal contact hit the port, my screen flashed black. It must have executed a silent auto-run script the moment my computer connected to my firm virtual private network." He dropped the silver drive onto the glass coffee table, like it was physically burning his skin. "Jasmine did not come here to beg Chloe. She came here to plant a Trojan horse. Before I could even process the sheer magnitude of the sabotage, my own cell phone began vibrating aggressively on the nightstand. The screen boldly displayed my father name. I answered the call and immediately put Jasmine on speaker so Caleb could hear the incoming threat. "Good morning, Chloe!" Jasmine practically sang into the receiver. His voice was dripping with absolute arrogant triumph. He sounded like a man who had just won the lottery instead of a man who had been legally locked out of his own failing empire just yesterday. "I hope you are enjoying your little hotel stay," Jasmine gloated. "I told you I was untouchable. You really thought you could outsmart me with a few fancy keystrokes and an administrative freeze. You thought you could just steal my life work. Well, I decided to return the favor. I hear the SEC is currently tearing apart your fiancé pristine little wealth management firm." "Caleb and I are not engaged," I said coldly, refusing to give him the satisfaction of hearing panic in my voice. "Oh, do not split hairs with me, little girl." Jasmine laughed harshly. "Boyfriend, fiancé, whatever he is to you, he is currently the prime suspect in a massive federal insider trading ring. The digital evidence linking his terminal to illegal offshore accounts is absolutely airtight. The feds are going to put him away for decades. Now here are my terms. You are going to log back into that Federal Reserve portal right now. You are going to completely lift the administrative freeze on all my corporate accounts, and you are going to legally reinstate my executive authority. Give me my company back or your fiancé goes to federal prison before the sun goes down." He did not wait for my answer. He simply ended the call, leaving the dial tone echoing loudly through the tense hotel suite. Caleb sank onto the edge of the velvet sofa, resting his head heavily in his hands. He was a brilliant wealth manager with a spotless ethical record, and Jasmine had just framed him for a career-ending federal crime. They have everything they need to indict me, Caleb whispered in quiet defeat. The malware must have spoofed my IP address and generated a fake transaction history directly from my authenticated login. I am finished, Chloe. I did not panic. I did not cry. I looked at Caleb and felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over my entire mind. I walked over to the glass coffee table and picked up the silver USB drive. Look at me, Caleb, I commanded, my tone radiating absolute authority. They rely on brute force because they lack intellect. Desmond solves every single problem in his life with a hammer. He throws bricks through car windows. He bribes bank managers. He frames innocent people to get his way. But he does not understand the actual architecture of the systems he is trying to manipulate. Let us show them how real auditors fight. Caleb looked up, his eyes searching my face for any sign of doubt. He found none. We immediately sprang into action. I refused to plug the infected drive back into a network-connected machine. Instead, I pulled a completely clean burner laptop from my travel bag. I disabled the wireless card, physically removed the internal antenna, and created a completely isolated digital sandbox environment. We plugged the malicious silver drive into the isolated terminal and watched the payload activate in a contained vacuum. For the next 2 hours, Caleb and I sat shoulder to shoulder, dissecting the malicious code line by line. We were not just reading the malware, we were actively reverse engineering it. I used a hex editor to strip away the encrypted layers of the executable file, while Caleb traced the fake transaction protocols the script had used to spoof his wealth management accounts. Desmond is barely smart enough to send an email with an attachment, I muttered, my fingers flying across the keyboard in a rapid blur. There is absolutely no way he coded a custom Trojan horse capable of bypassing bank-level enterprise security. He hired someone to build this, and whoever built it left digital fingerprints. We bypassed the surface-level spoofing and dug straight down into the root directory of the malware. Every piece of sophisticated malicious code has to phone home to a command server to dump its stolen data. We just needed to find the exact routing address the script was designed to communicate with. Caleb isolated the hidden transmission command buried deep within the fake transaction ledger. I ran a comprehensive trace route protocol on the embedded command signal, watching the raw data bounce across a series of international proxies on my screen. The signal leaped from a dummy server in Russia to a masked node in Brazil, before finally dropping its encrypted shield and landing squarely on its final destination, right here in Atlanta. I stared at the final IP address glowing brightly on the dark terminal screen. A grim, victorious smile spread across my face. The trace did not lead back to Desmond Real Estate Development Firm. The signal did not bounce back to my father. I turned the laptop screen so Caleb could see the final unmasked digital destination. The malicious software that had just framed him for federal insider trading was routing its stolen data directly to a private secure server located at Preston Luxury Real Estate Brokerage. I stared at the glowing IP address on the dark terminal screen as the absolute brilliance of the deception washed over me. Desmond was a loud, aggressive bully who smashed windows and screamed threats, but Preston was a silent, calculated predator. My father genuinely believed he was the one in control, using Preston offshore shell companies to hide his failing corporate assets. But Preston had been playing my father for an absolute fool. Preston had used Desmond's chaotic and loud bankruptcy preparations as the perfect smokescreen to quietly plant federal malware on Caleb's laptop. Preston knew that as a senior corporate liquidator, I was the only person smart enough to unravel their entire financial conspiracy. By framing my partner for federal insider trading, Preston was attempting to neutralize my only ally and force me into submission. We cannot just submit this IP trace to the Securities and Exchange Commission, I told Caleb, my mind racing through the legal protocols. A remote trace is circumstantial. A decent defense attorney will just argue that my father spoofed Preston IP address to frame him. If we want to clear your name and get your wealth management license reinstated immediately, we need the actual physical root directory logs. We need to pull the hard data directly from the private server sitting inside Preston Luxury Penthouse. Caleb looked at his watch, his expression hardening into pure determination. Getting past the building security is one thing, but Jasmine practically lives in that penthouse, Caleb said. She spends her entire day taking selfies by the rooftop pool. We cannot exactly conduct a covert server extraction with her lounging in the next room. I let out a sharp, confident laugh and pulled my secondary laptop out of my bag. Jasmine is completely obsessed with her own manufactured high society image, I said, opening a secure encrypted email client. She operates entirely on vanity and greed. We just need to offer her something she cannot possibly resist. I quickly drafted a flawless, highly sophisticated email masquerading as the senior public relations director for a top-tier luxury French fashion house. I used an exclusive spoofed domain name and addressed the email directly to Jasmine's private influencer account. I formally invited her to an incredibly exclusive VIP brand ambassador fitting at a high-end boutique located on the exact opposite side of the city. I added a strict confidentiality clause and promised a complimentary designer handbag just for attending. I hit send and we waited. Less than 20 minutes later, Caleb's phone buzzed with a social media notification. Jasmine had just posted a live video to her feed. She was sitting in the back of a luxury town car, wearing oversized sunglasses, and bragging to her followers about a massive secret brand deal she was about to sign. She had taken the bait flawlessly. The penthouse was completely empty. We drove straight to Preston Elite Residential Tower in the heart of the financial district. The building was a fortress of polished marble and armed security. We walked confidently up to the front desk, where a stern-looking concierge immediately moved to block our path. I did not give him a chance to ask for our names. I slapped my heavy federal corporate liquidator credentials directly onto the marble counter, alongside a thick stack of aggressively formatted legal documents I had drafted in the car. Surprise corporate asset inspection under federal mandate, I stated, my voice ringing out with absolute icy authority. This property was purchased using funds directly linked to Desmond Wilson Commercial Real Estate Holdings. Those assets are currently frozen under a Federal Reserve anti-fraud directive. You can either grant us immediate elevator access to the penthouse, or you can explain to the federal agents waiting outside why you are actively obstructing a federal financial liquidation. The concierge took one look at the bright gold seal on my credentials and the terrifying legal jargon on the paperwork. He swallowed hard, his arrogant demeanor vanishing instantly. He swiped his master keycard and silently directed us to the private elevator. The doors opened directly into Preston's sprawling glass-walled penthouse. We did not waste a single second admiring the breathtaking city views or the ridiculous modern art. We moved systematically through the massive apartment until we found Preston Home Office locked behind a heavy solid core door. Caleb utilized a specialized bypass tool to override the electronic keypad while I booted up my decryption software. Inside the room, the private server was humming quietly in a climate-controlled glass cabinet. I connected my terminal directly to the server core and bypassed the firewall in less than 3 minutes. Preston was arrogant enough to use the exact same alphanumeric password sequence he used for his Cayman Island shell accounts. The extraction was flawless. I pulled the raw, unedited root directory logs, proving unequivocally that the insider trading malware had originated from this exact server. Caleb's name was completely cleared. As the download finished, I noticed a large abstract painting hanging slightly off-center on the far wall. I walked over and pulled the heavy canvas aside, revealing a sleek biometric wall safe embedded directly into the steel framework. Preston had clearly spent a fortune on security, but he was fundamentally lazy. I wiped the keypad with a dusting cloth, illuminating the specific numbers he pressed most frequently. It took me exactly 4 attempts to crack the sequence using his offshore account routing digits. The heavy steel door clicked open. Inside the safe, resting beneath a stack of untraceable bearer bonds, was a thick manila folder labeled with Jasmine's full legal name. I pulled the folder out and opened it, expecting to find divorce papers or hidden prenuptial agreements. Instead, my blood turned completely to ice. It was a massive, comprehensive life insurance policy taken out on Jasmine exactly 3 weeks ago. The payout was a staggering $10 million. I flipped to the secondary clauses and my stomach violently dropped. Preston had paid an exorbitant premium for a highly specific double indemnity clause covering accidental death or fatal domestic trauma. He was not just planning to divorce Jasmine when the stolen money ran out. He was actively planning to murder her for the insurance payout. I stood in the center of the lavish penthouse, staring at the chilling documents in my hands. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room as Caleb walked over and read the insurance policy over my shoulder. He let out a sharp breath, stepping back from the safe, as the sinister reality of Preston Grand Design finally clicked into place. Preston had set up my father to take the fall for the corporate bankruptcy. He had framed Caleb to eliminate the only financial threat. And he had insured Jasmine to guarantee his own spectacular wealthy escape. A dark, conflicted storm raged in my mind. Jasmine was a horrible, toxic person. She had watched our father smash a landscaping brick into my face, and she had actively mocked my bleeding scars. She had gleefully helped steal my identity, and she had spent her entire adult life trying to make me feel small and worthless. A dark, vengeful part of my brain whispered that she absolutely deserved whatever fate Preston had planned for her. She had willingly attached herself to a parasite, and now the parasite was going to consume her. Caleb placed a warm, steady hand on my shoulder, breaking me out of my dark spiral. He looked at the documents and then looked directly into my eyes, his expression completely unwavering. "We destroy them with the law, Chloe." Caleb said, his voice a grounding force of absolute morality. "We destroy them with forensic evidence and federal indictments. We do not destroy them with blood. If we walk out of here and let him kill her, we are no better than they are." He was entirely right. I refused to let their toxic rot infect my soul. I pulled out my secure phone and snapped several high-resolution photographs of the $10 million life insurance policy, making sure the double indemnity accidental death clause was perfectly legible. I routed my phone through 3 different anonymous international proxies and sent the images directly to Jasmine's private number. I added a single stark message: "He is not leaving you. He is liquidating you. Run." I imagined the sheer panic that should have gripped Jasmine when she opened those messages, but I had severely underestimated the absolute depth of her narcissism and delusion. Across town, sitting in an empty boutique waiting for a brand ambassador fitting that was never going to happen, Jasmine received my anonymous text. Instead of recognizing the very real death sentence staring her in the face, her toxic vanity completely overrode her survival instincts. She looked at the multi-million-dollar insurance documents and actually laughed. She genuinely believed that I was so insanely jealous of her perfect marriage that I had maliciously photoshopped fake legal documents just to ruin her day. Jasmine immediately took a screenshot of the anonymous warning and forwarded the entire terrifying package directly to Preston's personal cell phone. She added her own mocking message complaining about my pathetic, jealous attempts to destroy their flawless high society romance. She thought she was proving her loyalty to her powerful husband. She had no idea she had just triggered the final explosive countdown. We were still standing in the penthouse office when Caleb's phone intercepted the massive spike in data traffic rushing through Preston's private server. Preston was sitting in his high-rise commercial office miles away, staring at the forwarded screenshots from his delusional wife. The moment he saw the photographs of the life insurance policy, he knew his physical wall safe had been completely compromised. He knew the federal logs clearing Caleb had been extracted, and he knew the authorities were closing in fast. The elaborate frame-up was dead, and his murder plot was exposed. He abandoned all pretense of saving his reputation. He just needed to take the stolen cash and disappear completely. "He is initiating a massive offshore sweep," Caleb shouted, pointing at the terminal screen as hundreds of encrypted authorization codes began flooding the network. "He is trying to force a total liquidation of Jasmine's remaining corporate assets. He is moving $20 million into a decentralized, untraceable crypto wallet in the Cayman Islands." Preston was moving with the frantic speed of a cornered animal. He thought he still possessed the backdoor administrative access to my father accounts. He thought he could just drain the last drops of the empire and vanish before the federal regulators knocked on his door. We watched the terminal screen as the massive $20 million wire transfer queued up in the system, holding in the final verification stage. I did not panic. I sat down at the console and calmly cracked my knuckles. I let him initiate the transfer. I let him type in every single fraudulent authorization code. I waited until the very last possible second when he hit the final execution command, believing he had just successfully stolen his ultimate golden parachute. The screen in Preston office instantly froze. The progress bar halted violently at 99%. A massive, blinding red error message completely overtook his monitor, locking him out of the entire banking system. The automated text read, "Transaction denied. Funds rerouted by acting CEO Chloe." Preston stared at the glowing red letters on his monitor until his vision blurred. The absolute reality of his situation crashed down on him like a physical blow. The $20 million he needed to vanish was gone. The digital frame job on Caleb was completely dismantled. The federal authorities were undoubtedly reviewing the unencrypted server logs at this exact moment, and the Securities and Exchange Commission would be pivoting their entire criminal investigation directly onto him. He was totally exposed. He had zero liquid capital to fund his escape, and his incredibly foolish wife was walking around with a target on her back, holding screenshots of the very life insurance policy he had planned to use to cash out. Jasmine was no longer a convenient high society prop. She was a massive, glaring liability. Preston violently swept his arm across his mahogany desk, sending his espresso cup and expensive monitors crashing to the polished floor. He needed cash immediately. He needed untraceable physical assets, and he knew exactly who had them. He stormed out of his luxury corner office, ignoring the frantic questions of his receptionist, and took the private elevator down to the parking garage. He drove his sleek European sports car through the Atlanta traffic like a madman heading straight for the wealthy northern suburbs. Inside the massive colonial mansion, Desmond was currently tearing his own extravagant mahogany study apart. He was hurling leather-bound books and crystal decanters at the walls, screaming furiously at his elite legal team over speakerphone. Valerie was cowering in the corner, clutching a silk handkerchief and weeping hysterically over the absolute destruction of her pristine social standing. The heavy oak doors to the study suddenly flew open, and Preston marched into the room vibrating with pure, desperate rage. "Give me my $20 million right now!" Preston roared, pointing a trembling finger directly at Desmond's face. "The offshore accounts are completely frozen. The shell company is dead. You owe me the shadow loan collateral, and I am collecting it today. Empty your physical wall safes, Desmond. Give me the bearer bonds, the gold, the diamonds. Give me everything you have hidden in this house." Desmond stopped tearing his books off the shelves and stared at his son-in-law with a mixture of absolute confusion and boiling anger. "You arrogant little punk!" Desmond bellowed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "Are you completely deaf? Chloe locked me out. That ungrateful, scarred brat hijacked the entire corporate structure and froze every single asset I own. I do not have $20 million in cash lying around in a wall safe. We are entirely cut off." Preston let out a harsh, manic laugh that echoed terribly against the high ceilings of the study. "You are a complete fool, Desmond. You always have been. You genuinely thought I cared about funding your pathetic, failing midtown plaza. You thought I actually wanted to help this toxic, sinking ship of a family. I never cared about your real estate projects." Valerie gasped loudly, stepping forward with her hands raised defensively. "Preston, how can you say that?" Valerie cried, her voice shrill with panic. "You are family. You married our Jasmine. You are supposed to protect us." "I married an easy mark," Preston sneered, turning his cold, dead eyes toward Valerie. "I married a vain, vacuous idiot because she came attached to an arrogant old man who was too blind to see his own empire crumbling. I did not just set up the offshore shell company to hide your debts, Desmond. I was the one who personally handed your cooked accounting books directly to the Internal Revenue Service 6 months ago. I tipped off the federal auditors about your decades of massive tax evasion. I laid out the entire paper trail for them. My plan was to let you rot in a federal penitentiary while I quietly swooped in and liquidated your entire real estate empire for pennies on the dollar." Desmond staggered backward, bumping heavily into his desk. The absolute betrayal radiated through the room. "You tipped off the IRS," Desmond whispered, his voice hoarse with shock. "You set me up. I set you up to take the fall for everything," Preston shouted, stepping aggressively toward the older man. "And it would have worked perfectly if your freak of a daughter had not bypassed my security server and hijacked the transfer." Neither of them noticed the figure standing frozen in the grand hallway just outside the open study doors. Jasmine had rushed straight home from her humiliating fake brand deal, feeling entirely panicked about the frozen bank accounts and the bizarre life insurance documents. She stood completely paralyzed, clutching her designer handbag as Preston viciously dismantled her entire reality. She heard every single word. She realized with crushing, devastating clarity that Preston had never loved her. He had never admired her beauty or cherished their high society romance. He had looked at her and seen nothing but a gullible, foolish pawn. He had married her solely because her father was a wealthy, corrupt target. Her entire perfect life was an elaborate, deadly lie. Miles away in our secure hotel suite, Caleb and I sat in absolute silence, staring at the glowing audio waveform on my laptop screen. When I had bypassed Preston biometric wall safe, I had not just extracted the malware logs. I had also quietly uploaded a covert background audio capture payload directly into Preston's personal cell phone, syncing the device to our encrypted server. We were listening to the entire vicious screaming match playing out live in Desmond's study. "We destroy them with the law," Caleb reminded me, gently placing his hand over mine. I nodded, keeping my eyes locked on the digital audio feed. I tapped a few keys on my keyboard, opening a secure routing protocol. I selected the live audio stream of Preston, fully confessing to massive corporate fraud and malicious IRS manipulation. I hit the execution key, forwarding the unencrypted live feed directly to the emergency dispatch servers of the Atlanta Police Department, flagging it as an active violent domestic disturbance at the Wilson estate. Within 10 minutes, the wailing shriek of multiple police sirens echoed through the wealthy suburban streets, cutting through the tense, screaming match in the mansion. Preston froze his head, snapping toward the large bay windows as the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the manicured front lawn. He instantly realized the walls were closing in. He did not say another word to Desmond or Valerie. He simply turned and sprinted out of the study, bolting toward the back of the massive house and slipping out through the decorative garden gates, abandoning his wife and his in-laws to face the music entirely alone. Two uniformed police officers aggressively knocked on the heavy oak front doors before pushing their way into the grand foyer. Desmond quickly wiped the sweat from his forehead and plastered on his most convincing, authoritative smile. He met the officers in the hallway, using his elite old money influence to completely downplay the situation. He smoothly explained that it was merely a loud, passionate family disagreement over a stressful business deal. While Valerie sobbed quietly in the background, Desmond smoothly handed each responding officer a thick banded envelope of $100 bills pulled from his emergency desk drawer. The corrupt officers exchanged a knowing glance, quietly pocketed the cash, and walked right back out the front doors, writing the incident off as a false alarm. Desmond stood in the center of his ruined foyer, the absolute gravity of the situation finally taking hold. The frozen offshore accounts, the sudden IRS audits, the perfectly timed police arrival. He connected the dots with brutal clarity. Preston was a snake, but Chloe was the architect of his current destruction. She was actively pulling the strings, dismantling his life piece by piece. His face twisted into a mask of pure murderous rage. He pulled out his encrypted burner phone and dialed a scrambled number. He called a rogue independent contractor he routinely used to handle fatal accidents on his commercial construction sites. He gave the man my exact home address and ordered a permanent, immediate solution. Back at the boutique hotel, I aggressively packed my heavy laptop into my bag. The federal freeze was holding, but we needed to leave the city immediately. The authorities would be swarming the firm and the mansion by morning. We need to make one stop before we hit the interstate. I told Caleb, zipping my bag closed. I have a physical backup drive hidden in the floorboard safe of my apartment. It contains the original unredacted ledgers proving Desmond's initial wire fraud. We cannot leave it behind. Caleb agreed, pulling his car around to the front of the hotel. We drove swiftly to my high-rise apartment building, keeping a low profile. The lobby was completely empty and quiet. Caleb stayed near the running car to keep watch while I hurried inside to retrieve the drive. I swiped my key fob and stepped into the sleek metal elevator car, pressing the button for the 18th floor. The heavy metal doors slid smoothly closed. The car began to rise, ascending rapidly through the building shaft. I leaned against the back wall, mentally running through our escape route. Then the elevator suddenly lurched violently. The digital floor indicator flickered and died. A horrific metallic screech echoed above me, followed by the unmistakable deafening sound of heavy steel cables snapping under extreme tension. The lights cut out completely, plunging the small metal box into absolute darkness. My stomach vaulted into my throat as the elevator car entered a terrifying unrestricted freefall. The air was entirely sucked from my lungs as the sensation of absolute zero gravity took over my body. The dark elevator shaft roared around me, a deafening symphony of snapping steel cables and grinding gears. I threw my arms over my head and braced for a fatal impact. Just as the floor rushed up to meet me, a violent bone-rattling slam vibrated through the entire metal carriage. The emergency braking calipers engaged, biting fiercely into the greased guide rails with a brilliant shower of orange sparks. The car shuddered violently, tearing raw metal from the walls before slamming to a brutal, jarring halt between the 14th and 15th floors. I was thrown hard against the back wall of the carriage, hitting the cold metal floor. A thick cloud of white smoke and pulverized drywall filled the small enclosed space, making it entirely impossible to breathe. I coughed aggressively, pulling my shirt over my mouth and nose. My left shoulder throbbed with a sharp, agonizing pain, and my knees were badly scraped, but I was breathing. I was alive. Desmond had sent a man to cut the main hoist cables, and I had survived by a fraction of a second. Chloe. Caleb's voice echoed loudly down the dark shaft from the floor directly above me. I heard the desperate, frantic sound of heavy steel doors being pried open by pure brute force. A sliver of bright hallway light cut through the thick dust. "I am here!" I shouted back, my voice hoarse and raw from the smoke. "I am at the bottom of the car." "Hold on," Caleb yelled. The light widened as he fully forced the outer hallway doors open, pinning them back with a heavy marble trash urn from the lobby. I heard him jump down onto the roof of my trapped elevator car. A second later, the emergency escape hatch above my head was kicked open. Caleb's face appeared in the opening backlit by the hallway lights. His expression was a mixture of absolute terror and overwhelming relief. He reached his arms down through the hatch. "Grab my hands," Caleb commanded. I climbed onto the handrail running along the back wall of the elevator and reached upward. Caleb gripped my wrists with bruising force and hoisted me straight up through the narrow metal opening. We scrambled off the roof of the damaged car and pulled ourselves up onto the solid marble floor of the 15th level hallway. We collapsed side by side against the wall, breathing heavily and covered in a thick layer of industrial soot. Before either of us could speak, my cell phone vibrated violently in my coat pocket. I pulled it out, shielding the cracked screen from the glare of the overhead lights. A new text message had arrived from an unregistered burner number. I recognized the phrasing and the cadence immediately. It was Valerie. "God punishes those who disrespect their parents," the message read. "Next time the brakes will not catch." I stared at the glowing screen for a long, silent moment. I did not feel fear. I did not feel panic. I felt a cold, absolute rage settling deep into the marrow of my bones. I handed the cracked phone to Caleb. He read the vicious message, and his jaw tightened, his hands curling into tight fists. "They just tried to murder you," Caleb said, his voice vibrating with a dangerous, protective edge. "Your own mother knew about this." I wiped a streak of blood and dust from my cheek and looked at him. "When I was 10 years old, Valerie stood on the front porch and happily watched Desmond take a pair of wire cutters to my bicycle brakes," I said, my voice dead and completely hollow. I had just won the regional spelling bee instead of Jasmine. Jasmine threw a tantrum and locked herself in her room. To make her feel better, they sabotaged my bike. I rode it down the steepest hill in our neighborhood and shattered my collarbone. Valerie told me God was punishing me for showing off and making my sister cry. They literally have not changed Caleb. They use the exact same playbook. They just escalated the hardware. I pushed myself off the marble floor and stood up. The lingering shock of the elevator crash completely evaporated, replaced by a highly calculated predatory focus. I was done playing defense. I was done reacting to their desperate, violent temper tantrums. "Where is Preston $20 million?" I asked, brushing the drywall dust off my coat. Caleb stood up beside me, wiping his hands on his slacks. "It is sitting in a locked federal holding ledger," Caleb replied. "You intercepted the wire transfer before it could hit the offshore Cayman accounts. The money is entirely frozen under your administrative liquidator credentials." "Good," I said, turning toward the emergency stairwell. "Jasmine and Valerie are hosting their massive annual charity gala this Saturday at the Ritz-Carlton. It is the absolute crown jewel of Valerie High Society calendar. I want you to log into the commercial debt registry right now. I want you to use my corporate credentials to leverage that $20 million. We are going to legally purchase the distressed commercial debt portfolio that contains the mortgage for that exact hotel." Caleb paused, his eyes widening as he realized exactly what I was planning. "You want to buy the hotel debt? I am not just going to freeze their bank accounts anymore, Caleb," I said, pushing open the heavy stairwell door. "They want to play with my life. I am going to take their kingdom. By Saturday evening, I will be their landlord." The night of the grand charity gala arrived with a suffocating wave of humid Georgia heat. The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was dripping in excessive, unimaginable wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant golden glow over 500 of the most elite, influential citizens in Atlanta. State politicians, wealthy real estate developers, and high society socialites mingled around towering arrangements of imported white orchids, sipping rare vintage champagne. Jasmine and Valerie were holding court near the grand entrance, playing the roles of the perfect philanthropic couple. Jasmine was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, sweating profusely under the bright lights, but forcing a wide, charismatic smile. Valerie was draped in hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of borrowed diamonds, laughing at the mayor jokes and pretending her entire world was not currently on fire. They were desperate. My federal surveillance of Desmond remaining accounts had revealed his ultimate endgame. He was completely broke and facing massive IRS indictments. He was using this highly publicized charity gala as a massive cash grab. He planned to aggressively solicit millions of dollars in untraceable donations, funnel the money through a clean shell account, and board a private jet straight to Dubai before the federal agents could secure an arrest warrant on Monday morning. Jasmine arrived an hour late, pushing her way through the heavy oak doors of the ballroom. She was wearing a skin-tight emerald green dress and a forced, strained smile. She looked completely exhausted. The socialites immediately swarmed her eagerly, asking where her handsome, wealthy husband was hiding. Jasmine lied through her teeth, reciting a perfectly rehearsed script about Preston attending a critical emergency business conference in London. She clutched her champagne flute so tightly, her knuckles turned white, pretending her marriage was a fairy tale, and ignoring the terrifying reality that Preston had vanished without a trace. Then the heavy ballroom doors swung open for a second time. The low hum of classical music and polite conversation slowly died out, rippling across the massive room until absolute dead silence fell over the crowd. Caleb and I stepped into the grand ballroom. I was wearing a stunning floor-length crimson gown that trailed heavily across the polished marble floor. I had not applied a single drop of makeup to my face. I had completely removed the white medical bandages. The jagged, angry red scars Desmond had given me were entirely exposed for the whole room to see. I wore them like a brutal, undeniable badge of honor. Caleb stood tall and composed beside me, wearing a sharp midnight blue suit, his presence radiating silent, dangerous authority. Valerie spotted me from across the room. The color instantly drained from her perfectly contoured face. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her fingers and shattered loudly on the marble floor. Desmond turned his head, his eyes locking onto me with a mixture of absolute terror and unhinged rage. Valerie recovered her senses first. Her desperation morphed into furious, aggressive panic. She abandoned her conversation with the mayor and stormed across the ballroom floor, her diamond necklace flashing under the chandeliers. She aggressively signaled to a group of large, imposing security guards standing near the catering entrance. "Get her out of here!" Valerie hissed, her voice shrill and echoing in the silent room. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "This woman is trespassing. She is violently unstable. Security, remove this woman from my gala immediately." The head of the private security detail, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit, stepped forward. He did not move toward me. He did not reach for his radio. He calmly stepped directly between me and my screaming mother. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked Valerie dead in the eye. "I am sorry, Ma, I'm the head of security," said his voice ringing out with crystal-clear finality. "I work for Ms. Chloe now." Valerie stood completely frozen, her mouth opening and closing silently as the head of security words echoed across the tense space. The heavy crystal champagne flute she had dropped lay in glittering, jagged shards across the polished marble floor between us. The absolute finality in the security chief voice acted like a physical blow to her pristine high society facade. The protective barrier of wealth and influence she had hidden behind her entire life was instantly, violently stripped away. The surrounding socialites, politicians, and elite business owners began to murmur among themselves, sensing the drastic shift in power. "Secure the perimeter," I commanded, my voice carrying effortlessly over the growing whispers of the crowd. "Nobody leaves this ballroom until I say so." The head of security gave a crisp, professional nod. He raised his radio to his mouth and issued a rapid series of tactical commands. All around the massive, opulent ballroom, the imposing security guards sprang into coordinated action. They moved in perfect unison, shutting the heavy, ornate oak doors and sliding the thick steel deadbolts firmly into place with loud, echoing clanks. They positioned themselves squarely in front of every single exit, blocking any potential escape routes. 500 of Atlanta's most powerful and influential citizens were suddenly sealed inside the room. A wave of genuine panic rippled through the sea of expensive pastel silk dresses and custom-tailored tuxedos. Jasmine's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated madness. He realized instantly that his grand master plan was completely disintegrating. He had invited these wealthy elites tonight specifically to drain their deep pockets, to solicit millions in untraceable charitable donations so he could fund his cowardly midnight flight to Dubai. Now he was trapped in a locked room with his marks, his corporate assets entirely frozen, and the daughter he despised standing before him as the absolute authority. The suffocating reality of his total defeat pushed him straight over the edge of sanity. "You ungrateful, scarred freak!" Jasmine roared, his voice vibrating with a primal, desperate fury. He lunged toward a passing waiter and violently snatched a heavy, full crystal champagne bottle from a silver serving tray. He raised the heavy glass weapon high above his head and charged directly at me, his eyes rolling back with murderous intent. He fully intended to crush my skull right there in the middle of the glittering ballroom. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not even blink. Before Jasmine could bring the heavy crystal bottle crashing down, Caleb moved with blinding, terrifying speed. Caleb stepped smoothly in front of me, intercepting the violent strike with absolute clinical precision. He blocked Jasmine's descending wrist with his left forearm, while simultaneously driving his right hand into the center of Jasmine's chest. Caleb twisted Jasmine's arm sharply behind his back, applying a brutal, calculated pressure to the joint. Jasmine let out a loud, agonizing gasp as the champagne bottle slipped from his fingers and crashed to the floor. Caleb kicked the back of Jasmine's legs, forcing the heavy older man to collapse directly onto his knees. The sickening thud of Jasmine's kneecaps hitting the solid marble floor silenced the entire ballroom. Caleb held him pinned firmly to the ground, rendering the arrogant patriarch completely powerless in front of his entire elite social circle. I stepped slowly toward my father, looking down at him as he kneeled in the shattered glass and spilled champagne. He was breathing heavily, his face flushed with humiliation and pain. You always told me violence was the only language you respected, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, icy whisper that cut through the dead silence of the room. How does it sound when someone else speaks it? Valerie let out a high-pitched, hysterical sob, clutching her diamond necklace as she stared down at her subdued husband. Chloe, please stop this, Valerie begged, her voice trembling with manufactured terror. You are ruining us. We are your family. I turned my gaze slowly toward my mother. When I was 10 years old, you stood on the front porch and smiled while you watched Dad take a pair of heavy wire cutters to my bicycle brakes. I said, my tone dead and completely hollow. I had just won the regional spelling bee instead of Jasmine. Jasmine threw a massive tantrum and locked herself in her room crying because she was not the center of attention. To make her feel better, you both deliberately sabotaged my bike. I rode it down the steepest hill in our neighborhood. The brakes failed, and I crashed into a brick retaining wall. I shattered my collarbone and fractured my wrist. You stood over my hospital bed and told me God was punishing me for disrespecting my parents and making my sister cry. You literally have not changed, Valerie. You still use the exact same pathetic playbook. You just escalated the hardware. Valerie's face drained of all color. The wealthy socialites standing nearby gasped in synchronized horror, stepping away from her in absolute disgust. You cannot do this to us, Desmond grunted, struggling uselessly against Caleb's iron grip. We booked this hotel. We are hosting this gala. You have no authority here. I let out a soft, cold laugh. That is where you are wrong, Dad, I replied, stepping back and smoothing down the skirt of my crimson gown. When you tried to drop me down an elevator shaft yesterday, I decided to stop playing defense. I took the $20 million I intercepted from Preston offshore account, and I used my administrative liquidation credentials to purchase the distressed commercial debt portfolio that contains the mortgage for this exact Ritz-Carlton property. I am not just a guest at your little party anymore, Desmond. I am your landlord, and this building is under new management. I turned my back on my kneeling father and walked calmly toward the main stage at the front of the ballroom. A massive projection screen hung suspended above the podium, waiting to play the emotional charity video Desmond had commissioned to scam his donors. I raised my hand and signaled the audiovisual technicians in the sound booth, who were now operating strictly under my direct corporate authority. The heavy velvet curtains parted, and the massive projector screen suddenly flashed to life, flooding the dark room with bright, harsh light. The image stabilized, and a collective shocked gasp echoed through the crowd of 500 guests. It was Preston's face. Preston was sitting in a stark, brightly lit cinder-block room, staring directly into the camera. He looked absolutely terrified. His designer suit was rumpled, his hair was disheveled, and he was sweating profusely. I had not just let Preston slip away into the night. While Caleb was securing our hotel suite after the elevator crash, I had actively tracked Preston's digital footprint. I used the flight manifest databases connected to the corporate servers to locate the exact private terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport where Preston was attempting to charter a desperate flight out of the country. I intercepted him right on the tarmac. During my deep dive into his personal servers, I had uncovered his massive, staggering debts to a highly violent international gambling cartel. I offered Preston a very simple, non-negotiable deal. He could sit in front of my camera and confess every single crime he had committed against my family, or I would personally hand his GPS coordinates and his flight itinerary directly to the cartel enforcers who were actively hunting him down. Preston, a complete coward to his very core, had immediately chosen the camera. The video began playing, his voice booming loudly through the state-of-the-art surround sound system. "My name is Preston Vance," he said, his voice shaking visibly on the massive screen. "I am recording this statement to confess to multiple counts of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy. Desmond Wilson is completely bankrupt. He has been running a massive financial shadow game for over a decade. The Midtown Plaza development is a complete fake designed to launder money and hide his pending lawsuits. He is using this charity gala to steal your donations so he can flee to Dubai and avoid federal prosecution." The ballroom erupted into a chaotic frenzy of furious whispers. Mayors, senators, and elite investors stared at Desmond with pure, unadulterated hatred, realizing they had been aggressively scammed by the man they considered a peer. But Preston was not finished. He took a nervous breath and continued staring miserably into the lens. Valerie Wilson is equally complicit. For the past 4 years, she has been systematically embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from the Community Church Restoration Fund. She has been funneling the holy money through dummy landscaping invoices to purchase her custom diamond jewelry and fund her lavish elite garden parties. A group of prominent church board members standing near the ice sculpture actually shrieked in horror. They glared at Valerie, who was now violently shaking and trying to hide behind a towering arrangement of white orchids. Preston swallowed hard, a bead of sweat rolling down his pale face. He looked down at the table in front of him before delivering the final crushing blow. "I also confess to insurance fraud and conspiracy to commit murder," he stated, his voice dropping to a dull, monotone pitch. "I never loved Jasmine Wilson. I only married her because Desmond was an arrogant, blind fool, and his company was an incredibly easy mark. 3 weeks ago, I took out a secret $10 million life insurance policy on Jasmine with a double indemnity clause for accidental trauma. Once the corporate funds were secured, I planned to stage a fatal domestic accident at our penthouse. I was going to push her down the glass staircase, snap her neck, collect the payout, and vanish." The video cut to black, leaving the massive ballroom in a state of absolute stunned paralysis. Jasmine was standing completely frozen near the front row of tables. Her emerald green designer dress suddenly looked like a tragic costume. The sheer magnitude of her delusion finally violently shattered. The reality crashed into her mind with the force of a freight train. She looked at Desmond, still kneeling on the floor, and she looked at Valerie, cowering behind the flowers. She realized with crushing, devastating clarity that her parents had eagerly, happily sold her off to a literal sociopathic murderer just to secure a shiny business alliance. They had essentially traded her actual life to prop up their failing real estate empire. Jasmine let out an unhinged, blood-curdling scream that tore through the silent ballroom. She kicked off her expensive designer heels, leaving them abandoned on the marble floor, and lunged directly at her mother. Jasmine tackled Valerie with the feral intensity of a wild animal, sending them both crashing backward into the towering orchid display. Glass vases shattered and water spilled everywhere. Jasmine grabbed a fistful of Valerie's perfectly styled hair and began tearing wildly at the borrowed diamond necklace, screaming hysterically that they had sentenced her to death. Desmond roared and scrambled up from the floor, trying to pull his crazed daughter off his wife. Caleb calmly stepped back, letting Desmond stumble directly into the chaotic fray. The perfect, pristine, untouchable Wilson family completely devolved into a vicious, humiliating physical brawl right on the main stage. They were rolling around in the spilled champagne and broken glass, tearing at each other expensive formal clothes and screaming vicious obscenities. The entire elite high society of Atlanta watched in horrified, captivated silence as the prominent family actively destroyed themselves. I stood completely still, watching the pathetic, violent carnage unfold. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I reached out and picked up a wireless microphone resting on the nearby podium. I flipped the switch, and the sharp electronic whine of audio feedback cut cleanly through the sounds of the brawl. "Enjoy the show, everyone," I said, my voice perfectly calm, echoing with devastating finality across the grand ballroom. "But please clear the room. The building is officially condemned." The elite crowd did not wait for a second invitation. A massive synchronized wave of absolute panic swept through the grand ballroom as the city's most powerful politicians, investors, and socialites scrambled desperately for the exits. They pushed and shoved against each other, abandoning their half-empty champagne flutes and trampling over the imported floral arrangements. No one wanted to be caught in the blast radius of a federal raid. They fled into the humid Atlanta night, leaving the magnificent Ritz-Carlton ballroom looking like a glittering war zone. Broken glass, crushed orchids, and spilled wine covered the polished marble floors. In the center of the ruined space, the physical brawl between the remaining members of the Wilson family sputtered to a pathetic halt. Desmond was gasping for air, his custom tuxedo torn and stained. Valerie was weeping hysterically, clutching her ruined hair, while Jasmine sat completely motionless on the floor, her emerald dress soaked in water and champagne. I walked slowly down the steps of the main stage, the heavy crimson fabric of my gown sweeping quietly across the debris. Caleb flanked me, his eyes scanning the cavernous room for any sudden movements. I stopped a few feet away from my father. He looked up at me, his chest heaving, his expression shifting rapidly from lingering rage to a sudden horrifying realization of his true position. "You do not own this building," Desmond croaked, his voice shaking as he tried to push himself up from the floor. "You cannot condemn a Ritz-Carlton. You do not have the legal authority." I looked down at him, my face a mask of absolute freezing calm. "You really have not been paying attention, Desmond," I replied, my voice echoing in the empty ballroom. "When I hijacked Preston's $20 million wire transfer, I did not just park the cash in a holding account. I routed it directly through Caleb Offshore Management Firm and executed a hostile takeover of your primary lender. I legally purchased the entire distressed commercial debt portfolio that contains the master mortgage for this hotel and every single one of your failing midtown properties. You have been in default for over 90 days. As the sole owner of that debt, I initiated an immediate total foreclosure on your entire estate at noon today." Desmond's face turned the color of wet ash. His eyes darted around the room as the sheer magnitude of his financial obliteration finally crashed over him. "You do not own the mansion in the suburbs anymore," I continued, stepping closer. "You do not own the corporate high-rise. You do not own the cars, the offshore shells, or the art collection. I seized it all as collateral for your unpaid massive debts. You are completely liquidating Desmond. You are standing in a building that I now own wearing a tuxedo that you can no longer afford. You have absolutely nothing left." The last remnants of Desmond's arrogant pride instantly vanished. The powerful, terrifying patriarch who had ruled our family with an iron fist completely shattered. He dropped heavily onto his hands and knees. The broken crystal fragments sliced into his palms, but he did not seem to notice. He began to drag himself across the wet marble floor, crawling pitifully toward the hem of my dress. "Chloe, please," Desmond sobbed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "You have to stop this. You are my daughter. You are my blood. I was just trying to keep the business afloat." It was Valerie. Desmond aggressively pointed a trembling, bloody finger at his wife, who was sitting paralyzed in the ruined orchid display. Valerie spent the money, Desmond shrieked, throwing the woman he had been married to for 40 years directly under the bus. She embezzled the church funds. She demanded the diamonds and the parties and the lifestyle. She drove the company into debt. I was just trying to make her happy. She is the criminal, Chloe. Let me go. I can help you run the empire. We can do it together." Valerie let out a sound that was half scream and half animalistic screech. She scrambled to her feet, her borrowed diamond necklace swaying wildly against her chest. "You cowardly, miserable liar!" Valerie shrieked, her face contorted with vicious, self-preserving rage. She turned her venomous gaze directly onto Jasmine, who was still sitting silently on the floor. "It was her fault," Valerie yelled, pointing at her youngest daughter. "Jasmine, greedy, toxic vanity drained us dry. She demanded the penthouse. She demanded the European shopping sprees. She brought that murderous sociopath Preston into our home. Jasmine is the reason we are bankrupt. She ruined this family. Punish her, Chloe. Take her and let us go." Jasmine snapped her head up, staring at her mother with absolute horrified disbelief. "You sold me to a murderer!" Jasmine screamed back, her voice completely unhinged. "You knew he was a monster, and you pushed me to marry him just to secure a real estate contract. You wanted me dead." The three of them instantly devolved into a chaotic screaming match, viciously tearing each other apart, trying desperately to offer the others up as sacrificial lambs to save their own skin. They possessed zero loyalty, zero morality, and zero love. They were nothing but parasites turning on each other the moment the host body died. I stood beside Caleb, watching them rip each other to shreds. The final piece of my childhood trauma dissolved into thin air. They were not powerful monsters. They were just sad, pathetic, empty people. "You raised us to believe survival meant stepping on someone else's neck." I said, my voice slicing cleanly through their frantic screaming. I looked directly into Desmond's panicked eyes. Now you have no necks left to step on but your own. Before Desmond could offer another pathetic plea, a brilliant flash of alternating red and blue light suddenly flooded through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand ballroom. The harsh strobe lights illuminated the dark, rain-soaked streets outside the hotel. Dozens of heavily armored police cruisers, black unmarked FBI vans, and imposing tactical IRS vehicles completely surrounded the Ritz-Carlton, barricading every single exit and cutting off any possible avenue of escape. The cavalry had officially arrived. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom violently burst open. A massive tactical unit of federal agents and heavily armed police officers swarmed into the room, their heavy boots thundering against the marble floor. Bright tactical flashlights cut through the dim lighting, pinning Desmond, Valerie, and Jasmine exactly where they stood. Desmond Wilson, a stern-looking FBI agent, shouted, his voice booming with unquestionable authority. He marched directly toward my father, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. You are under arrest for massive corporate fraud, international money laundering, federal tax evasion, and the aggravated physical assault of Chloe Wilson. Desmond did not fight back. He did not yell for his elite defense attorneys. He simply went entirely limp, sobbing loudly as the federal agent roughly yanked his arms behind his back and locked the cold metal cuffs securely around his wrists. The reality of a life sentence in a federal penitentiary broke him completely. 2 steps away, a female IRS special agent grabbed Valerie by the arm. Valerie Wilson, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud and the malicious embezzlement of nonprofit charity funds, the agent stated, reading her rights with clinical precision. Valerie thrashed wildly against the agent grip, her expensive gown tearing at the shoulder. She dug her heels into the marble floor, her eyes darting frantically around the room, until they locked onto me. Chloe! Valerie screeched, her voice echoing with sheer terrified desperation. Chloe, you have to pay my bail. You have $20 million. You have to help me. I am your mother. You cannot let them take me to a concrete cell. Please, Chloe, do something. I looked at the woman who had watched my father cut my bicycle brakes. I looked at the woman who had mocked my bleeding scars. I tilted my head slightly, keeping my expression perfectly blank. Try Uber, Mom, I replied, my voice absolutely freezing. You will figure it out. Valerie let out a devastating wail as the federal agents forcibly dragged her toward the ballroom exit, her expensive borrowed heels dragging helplessly across the floor. At that exact moment, the side doors near the catering kitchen swung open. 2 massive, stern-faced United States Marshals hauled a battered, terrified figure into the bright lights of the ballroom. It was Preston. His designer suit was ripped, his face was bruised, and his arrogant demeanor was entirely erased. The federal authorities had intercepted him right on the airport tarmac, just moments before he could board a desperate charter flight to South America. He looked completely broken, his hands shackled heavily in front of him. Jasmine, who had been watching her parents get hauled away in absolute shock, turned and saw her husband in federal chains. She let out a quiet, broken sob, pulling her knees to her chest. She had nothing. Her marriage was a murder plot. Her parents were federal criminals. Her entire identity as a wealthy elite socialite was completely vaporized. A female federal agent walked briskly over to where Jasmine sat on the floor. Mom, the agent said, her tone strictly professional. We have a federal seizure warrant for all assets purchased with embezzled corporate funds. We need the jewelry. Jasmine's hands trembled violently as she reached up to unfasten the massive diamond necklace Preston had given her for their anniversary. She slowly handed over the necklace, followed by her diamond earrings, her platinum bracelets, and finally her massive custom engagement ring. The federal agent dropped the millions of dollars worth of stolen jewels into a clear plastic evidence bag, sealing it tightly. Jasmine sat shivering in her ruined, wet dress, completely stripped of her manufactured armor. She slowly raised her head and looked up at me. Her eyes were wide and red-rimmed, stripped of the usual arrogant venom. She looked at the crimson gown I was wearing. She looked at the raw, uncovered scars on my face that she had mocked for years. She looked at the total, unwavering power I commanded in a room that her parents used to own. She extended a shaking, empty hand toward me, silently expecting a handout, expecting me to rescue her the way our parents always had. I walked slowly over to my sister. I reached into my small clutch purse and pulled out a single crisp white rectangle. I placed it gently into her trembling palm. Jasmine looked down at her hand. It was not a blank check. It was not a key to a luxury hotel suite. It was a simple standard business card for a local Atlanta women's shelter. I turned my back on the shattered remnants of the Wilson family, taking Caleb's arm as we walked smoothly out of the ruined ballroom, leaving them all behind in the flashing red and blue lights, to finally face the absolute unyielding consequences of their actions. The aftermath of the Ritz-Carlton raid dominated the national news cycle for months. The federal prosecutors did not waste a single second offering leniency. The unencrypted server logs Caleb and I extracted from Preston Penthouse provided an absolute, indisputable roadmap of Desmond's entire criminal enterprise. It was the easiest conviction the district attorney had ever secured. Desmond stood in the federal courtroom looking like a hollowed-out shell of his former terrifying self as the judge handed down a staggering 25-year sentence in a maximum-security federal penitentiary. He was convicted of massive corporate fraud, international money laundering, and the aggravated physical assault against a federal liquidator. He did not look at me once as the bailiffs led him away in heavy iron shackles. Valerie's trial was equally brief and humiliating. The prominent church board members she had defrauded sat in the front row watching with absolute icy disdain as she was sentenced to 10 years for systemic wire fraud and malicious embezzlement. She spent her entire sentencing hearing weeping loudly into a tissue waiting for a high society rescue that never came. Preston realized his massive cartel debts made him a walking dead man outside of federal custody. He aggressively accepted a 20-year plea deal, trading his full confession for a placement in a highly secure protected facility. He traded his luxury penthouse for a concrete box and considered himself incredibly lucky to still be breathing. Jasmine experienced the most brutal reality check of all. The federal seizure warrant stripped her of every single asset purchased with stolen money. Her designer wardrobe, her imported cars, her sprawling penthouse, everything vanished overnight. Her massive social media following immediately turned on her, transforming her comment sections into a toxic wasteland of mockery and disdain until she was forced to permanently delete her entire online presence. Last Tuesday, I saw a candid photo of her published in a local gossip blog. She was wearing a cheap polyester uniform, scanning barcodes behind the register of a discount retail store in the outer suburbs. Her face was exhausted and completely devoid of the arrogant venom that had defined her entire existence. She was finally living the unremarkable life she had always mocked. With the key players permanently locked away, the federal bankruptcy courts officially appointed me as the primary liquidator for Wilson Real Estate Holdings. I spent the next 6 months systematically dismantling my father's toxic empire piece by piece. I sat at the head of the boardroom table and legally dissolved every single corrupt shell company. I sold off the failing midtown properties to legitimate developers and ensured that every defrauded contractor and cheated investor was paid back in full. I stood on the sidewalk in the financial district and watched a heavy construction crane rip the massive gold Wilson logo off the side of the corporate high-rise. I actively dissolved the poisonous legacy that had tormented my life for 29 years. I ground the corrupt empire into dust and scattered it to the wind. When the final legal documents were signed and the corporate entity was officially dead, Caleb and I left Atlanta. We did not throw a lavish party or seek the approval of any elite social circles. We drove down to a quiet, secluded beach on the coast of South Carolina. The ocean air was crisp and clean, an absolute stark contrast to the suffocating toxic atmosphere of my childhood. We stood barefoot in the white sand as the sun began to set over the water. Our wedding was incredibly small and perfectly private. There were no frantic screaming matches over floral arrangements. There was no arrogant father demanding a prominent photo opportunity to boost his public image. There was no jealous sister throwing a violent tantrum to steal the spotlight. There was only the rhythmic, soothing sound of the crashing waves and the absolute unwavering devotion in Caleb's eyes as he slipped a simple, elegant gold band onto my finger. We spoke our vows quietly, exchanging promises of genuine partnership and fierce protective loyalty. It was the first time in my entire life that I felt entirely safe. I finally knew what profound, unbroken peace felt like. Returning to the city, we began the next chapter of our lives not as victims but as conquerors. During the massive asset seizure, the federal courts officially awarded me full legal discretion over the recovered $20 million I had intercepted from Preston Offshore Sweep. I did not buy a sprawling mansion or a fleet of luxury sports cars. I used the massive capital to build something that actually mattered. I opened a massive state-of-the-art foundation in the heart of the financial district. We hired a brilliant team of forensic accountants, ruthless corporate lawyers, and dedicated social workers. Our sole mission was to provide absolute, overwhelming legal and financial firepower for victims of financial domestic abuse. We actively hunted down toxic spouses and corrupt family members who used money as a weapon to trap and control their victims. We dismantled hidden accounts, exposed fraudulent debts, and gave desperate people the resources they needed to break free and rebuild their lives completely independent of their abusers. I stood in my sleek new corner office, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows at the sprawling city skyline below. The afternoon sun cast a warm golden light across my polished mahogany desk, illuminating the stacks of legal files we were preparing for our next major case. Caleb walked into the office carrying 2 cups of coffee, his presence a steady, grounding force. He smiled, handing me my cup and pressing a soft kiss to my temple before stepping back to admire the view with me. I looked at my reflection in the dark tinted glass of the window. I raised my free hand and gently traced the jagged, uneven line of the scar on my cheek. The memory of the landscaping brick my father had thrown no longer carried any power over me. The pain and the humiliation were completely gone, replaced by an ironclad sense of purpose. I smiled, a genuine, fierce expression of absolute triumph. The scar was no longer a tragic mark of victimization. It was the undeniable battle scar of a queen who had taken a single thrown brick and used it to build an empire.